All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Monarch 101 webinar. I'm going to go ahead and get us started right on time. I know that everyone's time is precious. We're very fortunate today to have Mace Vaughn here with us, all the way from Canada. Mace serves as the director for Xerces Society's Pollinator and Ag Biodiversity Program, and since 2008 as a partner biologist and conservation entomologist to the NRCS West National Tech Support Center. Mace has over 25 years of experience working on insect and pollinator conservation issues across the US and abroad, where he's helped to improve federal and state policy to support pollinators, implement national conservation programs, restore habitat, write guidelines, teach diverse audiences, and conduct research and monitoring to conserve biodiversity. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to mute your microphones as this presentation is being recorded. And as we go through this presentation, please place any questions that you might have in the chat. I'm going to try to monitor those, as is Mace, and we'll try to address those before we finish today. If for some reason we do get short on time, I'll make sure to answer those and send out those answers to the group at a later date. Let's see. Also, before I forget to say this, for those of you in Oregon, please make sure that you stick around for the post presentation quiz, and I'll put that link in the chat so that you can do that right before you finish. So with the housekeeping out of the way, welcome Mace. I will turn it over to you, and thank you again for joining us.
Awesome. No, thank you. This is phenomenal. Yeah, pretty excited to do this. And yeah, this is frankly, it's a pretty fun webinar to deliver. It's I think an interesting topic to talk about. And it's, I feel like with those of you there working with the NRCS in the field offices or the state office, I don't know, it's kind of nice to circle back around to natural history and to learn about some of these animals and wildlife that we're working to protect. So let's see, I'm just trying to think. I guess just to start off, yep, thanks for that introduction. I want to give a quick shout out to a few folks at Xerces who over the years have helped put these slides together and helped me put these slides together, particularly Emma Pelton, Candace Fallon, Ray Morantz. These are a collection of our Monarch experts at Xerces. We've got a pretty deep bench there of folks on the ground who support me and then support NRCS as well. In our work together. So I also want to say a big thanks to Christina for helping to pull this together, for the work we've been doing, not just with Oregon, but with Washington NRCS as well. Peter McBride, the state biologist in Washington, and Rachel Maggi, who I've worked with for years. Before even Peter was on board, working with Rachel on Monarch trainings up in Washington. It's really the three of you.
I'm good. So I'm calling. I just got a call from the state. The
looks like we
water
need to
pipeline.
get folks to mute their
So we
lines,
applied for the
please.
200,000.
Yep, we're going to
It's
need.
not
I'll take 200,000. Okay, thank you. Anyway, just real big thanks to Christina, Peter, and Rachel for your collaboration over the years, developing a lot of the tools, as well as this training that we'll be talking about this week and next, which I will come back to. Just for those of you who are maybe newer to NRCS and maybe new to seeing the partnership and collaboration between Xerces, the Xerces Society and the NRCS, I wanted to start off quickly with just a couple of slides for context, just to help you understand the work of the organization that I work for, now also in partnership with NRCS. For those who haven't come upon Xerces before, we are an international nonprofit organization that works to protect wildlife and biodiversity through the conservation of invertebrates in their habitat. We're a science-based organization, and we work with a really diverse group of, at this point, hundreds, maybe thousands of partners: scientists, land managers, federal agency, state agency staff, farmers, ranchers, educators, policymakers, community members, just a ton of different folks using or conducting applied research, providing educational resources, addressing policy implications, helping to put the Farm Bill into practice. We really endeavor to make this sort of long-term conservation a reality. And the program, I should say, we work on a whole range of things. I mean, we're best known for pollinator work and monarch work, perhaps. But I and my team also support conservation biological control efforts for pest management, ag biodiversity in general, endangered species, aquatic invertebrate work, which we're seeing more of in Oregon and Washington with NRCS, I think in the months ahead. Helping with pesticide risk reduction, urban conservation. We hold a certification called Be Better that NRCS helped fund through a CIG, a standard for farmers who want to have a third-party recognition about adopting and implementing pollinator conservation on their farms, as well as the Bee City, Bee Campus USA program and a whole variety of community science efforts. So just a real big picture, there are now 85 staff working at Xerces across a whole range of conservation programs like these. But the team I manage, and this is where I think it's useful to understand from an NRCS perspective, I've got a team of soon to be 30 staff, 16 of whom are in partner biologist positions, either at field office level, state office level, or the regional office level, as am I at the West Tech Center, technically out of Portland, Oregon. All those folks in black here on this screen just gives you a sense of where these partner biologists are on the ground. So this collaboration with NRCS, I mean, this goes back to 2004. So we've got 20 years of working closely with NRCS to help in implementing Farm Bill conservation programs on the ground. Those other folks, the folks in orange here, are part of our Living Farms team, working again with farmers, with ranchers all across the country, just helping in the implementation of pollinator beneficial insect wildlife habitat projects all across the country. The other important context for all this is we've been working with NRCS on monarch conservation. Similarly, going back more than a decade at this point, we've helped stand up the Central Region's conference report in collaboration with the Fish and Wildlife Service and NRCS on monarch protection for the whole central U.S. We support and are a partner in the New England Pollinator Partnership, which is a collaboration of the service and the NRCS and Xerces in the New England states, focusing on monarchs and declining bumblebees. And we've worked with, states in the Southeast and Florida, Colorado, the Great Plains, developing habitat assessment guides, plant lists, et cetera. But then particularly me and my work in the Western states, especially with Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and to a certain degree, California, helping to build tools that we're going to talk about this week and next, as well as in our training together on the ground in June in Oregon, May actually, coming up pretty soon in Washington, to help in implementation of habitat evaluation and conservation planning for monarchs in the West. So just to give you a sense of where we work and where we've been working and the scope of our monarch collaboration with NRCS over the last several years. For those of you in Oregon, I don't know, maybe even Southern Washington, I'm not sure. I also want to point out that the Pollinator Partnership has a relatively new partner biologist on the ground out of Pendleton area. So for those of you in Oregon on the east side, you've got even another resource out there who's tapped into supporting habitat evaluation and conservation planning in Eastern Oregon. And so that's pretty exciting, and just more capacity, ideally, to help make this work as easy as possible, as effective as possible, and I don't know, keeping it fun too for everybody out there on the ground. So with that, I just wanted to give that, additional background before we sort of dug into the meat of it today. So today we're going to focus on the biology of the monarch butterfly. We're going to look at its life history, its migration. What does monarch habitat look like? What do we need to be thinking about when it comes to conservation planning for monarchs? What's the current knowledge on the conservation status and threats to the monarch, especially with a focus on the Western population? And then I feel like it's interesting to at least give a bit of an update to just what's going on with Western monarch research and some of the strategic modeling efforts that are underway to help us understand how to most effectively basically implement monarch conservation on the ground in the West. So that's today's agenda. We're also going to have a follow-up webinar next week at the same time where we dig into an updated monarch habitat evaluation guide, really geared toward the needs of NRCS. So that'll be a follow-up webinar to this. I'll talk a little bit more at the end. And just as a reminder for folks who maybe came on a little bit late, Christina is going to post a quiz that everyone's going to need to take to demonstrate that they've listened and we're here for the whole training. Or if you're watching a recording of this later, it'll be important documentation of participating in the training by filling out this quiz at the end. So again, just something else to look forward to. So that's what we've got going on here, probably for the next 45 minutes or so. Again, as Christina mentioned, if you've got questions, put them into the chat. I'll probably try to take them as we go because it's not going to be too hard for me to track those as they come in. So if I'm going along and you feel like, wait a second, I didn't quite get that, or it led to a quick question, put it in the chat. And if it looks like something fast and seems like it'll help with the flow, I'll totally answer it right away. Some of them I may wait until the end if it looks like it might be part of a larger discussion. All right, so with that, let's dive right in. All right, monarch biology. That's what we're going to start with. Kick things off here with that. So we're focused on the monarch butterfly, right? And it is native to primarily North America, through Central America, a little bit South America, right? However, over the last almost 200 years now, this is one of those crazy animals that's been spread throughout the world. So one thing I think that's, I don't know if it's useful or not, but one thing for us to keep in mind as we think about monarch conservation is that the species itself is unlikely to go extinct. However, the phenomena of the migration of the monarch, which we're going to talk about a fair bit here in the slides ahead, this movement from overwintering sites in either Mexico or California all throughout North America and back, that phenomena is what scientists are worried about, where we've seen such dramatic declines in the species over the last, especially 40 years. But this is a butterfly that's been introduced to islands all throughout the Pacific and Indonesia. I mean, it's been spread around into a lot of places. So I don't know, useful or not, I think it's worth knowing that this is a butterfly that's been moved throughout the world. But what we're most concerned about when it comes to its conservation is the persistence of its migration and what that means, in the US and Canada, as well as Mexico, primarily. I think it's helpful just to have an understanding of the basic life cycle of the monarch. So it is, the female monarch butterflies go around, they lay these single eggs. I'll come back to this in a second, on milkweed plants. They're going to sit there for 3 to 5 days, do their thing before they hatch. And that timing on hatching and the timing of development, all of that is really dependent upon the weather conditions at the time. If it's colder, things go slower. If it's warmer, things tend to go a little bit faster. A lot of people, I don't know, for when I'm in monarch country and they're present, I tend to look on milkweed when I see it just to see if I'm finding eggs or caterpillars. You may see collections of eggs like this. These are not monarch eggs. This right here is actually a picture of a bunch of ladybug eggs that are gathered together. Stink bugs will lay eggs in groups like this. So if you see a collection of eggs, it's most definitely not a monarch. They just lay these eggs in single eggs on the plants just like that. So just something, I don't know, when you're out there, it's something you could be looking out for. They will hatch, like I said, after 3 to 5 days. They go through 5 instars. That's a fancy entomologist way of saying that they're going to shed their skin 5 times as they get bigger. Monarchs, like all insects, have that exoskeleton that both gives them their structure, but also confines their growth. And so they need to shed that skin regularly as they grow. So they will grow pretty dramatically in those 5 steps over the course of 10 to 14 days, again, depending on food resources, temperature, all these different things. If everything is great, they could crank through this pretty quickly. Then they'll pupate, and they'll typically go wander for a little bit. It's pretty typical for butterflies. a lot of moths to drop down from whatever host plant they are on and move across the landscape a little bit, find themselves a new safe place to climb up and to, in this case, to make their chrysalis, which is this beautiful thing right here. This pupal stage lasts again for 10 to 14 days. And so that total time from an egg to a new adult is about 28 days. It's about a month. And it's useful to know this because as we talk about the migration, you know, the butterflies that spend the winter, let's say in the coast of California, they're going to move across the landscape in a series of generations. And each of those generations to grow takes about a month. And so that way you can think we've got about 4-ish generations that move out, and then that last one turns around and moves back to the coast. As a random, just interesting natural history fact, it's kind of cool the way you color patterns or the way colors are made in a whole variety of animals, whether it's hummingbirds or insects, like these different, the black, the gold on this chrysalis that you can see here, these are actually not pigments. Those colors come from just layers of material. Oh, I'm forgetting what it's called. There you go. That's not always perfect, but they'll lay down different layers of material as they are, you know, forming this chrysalis, and how the light refracts through those layers is what leads to these different colors. Same thing happens on the wings of hummingbirds, where you see that iridescence, or morpho blue butterflies in the tropics. There's not actually, say, a blue or even a red color. You're actually getting this iridescence, or some of these different colors, just from layers of clear material that, you know, are laid down in feathers, or in this case, in the chrysalis. I don't know, just a random little thing that I think is kind of cool. Okay, let's talk migration. So what's interesting about the monarch, similar to birds, but a little different in important ways, it is a true long distance migration. So this happens in the eastern population of the monarch butterfly, which is primarily all those butterfly species on the east side of the Rocky Mountains, east side of the Continental Divide. They all pretty much all go down to central Mexico for the winter. The butterflies that are there in eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, those are almost all of those butterflies are going to make their way to the coast of California. So it's a true long distance migration. Unlike birds, I mean, this happens over the course of 4 generations. So it's the great, like, I don't know, some butterfly's great grandkid that ultimately makes its way back to where it's going to spend the winter. They do this using an internal compass. They've got an internal clock. They can sense the sun, the time of the day, time of the year, even the Earth's magnetic field. All these different things play into their ability to move out from those overwintering sites on the coast of California to the east, and then to the north, and then ultimately back to where they overwinter. And they'll typically arrive on the western overwintering sites on the Pacific coast late September through October, and then they usually break up and leave those sites in the past, you know, February or March. What's interesting, and we'll talk a little bit about this, with climate change, some of that breakup of those overwintering sites is happening earlier and earlier, and that has the potential to cause problems. If we look at this migration, just to kind of show you an illustration, you can see here this eastern population making its way down to Mexico. We do know that a few of the western butterflies, they also make their way down. We're not sure. It's possible that some butterflies from Mexico may actually move into the western population. So some of these, some of these pathways we're still looking for evidence to understand. But you can see in the east in the springtime that southeastern US is where the bulk of these butterflies are. Some are there all throughout. In the west, it's quite interesting. Like, we've got butterflies that move, and we don't, they do move in a front. They move across that whole landscape, but a lot of them stick around. So some stay, some move. There's just a lot about the whole western migration that we don't have totally dialed in. So you might have butterflies throughout this whole region that are present in the spring and the summer, whereas in the east, we tend to see these butterflies in the spring here, and then in the summer up here. And they kind of keep moving through the southeastern US, whereas they may stay around here in the western states. Let's see, when we think about overwintering sites, even though for those of you in Oregon and Washington, we're not, like, these overwintering sites are not in our backyard like they are for folks down in California. So I figured I'd spend some time chatting a little bit about what these look like. So when the butterflies gather there, late September, October, November, they're getting hunkered down for the winter. They're going to cluster in these protected microhabitats that are provided by coastal groves of trees. So these trees form windbreaks from the Pacific winds. They traditionally would have been Monterey pine, Monterey cypress. Now they're eucalyptus as well. So they will gather together in these large clusters in the old days in California with hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, but certainly hundreds of thousands of butterflies all at one site, just like shingles draping off of these trees. When they are in this winter diapause, they stop laying eggs for the winter, with very few exceptions. In fact, in California, we very strongly recommend that we do not have milkweed planted near overwintering sites because we don't want to have butterflies triggering, landing on a milkweed and being like, oh, I should start laying eggs on a warm day, when really they need to just stay hunkered down and basically chilled out for the winter. There are over 400 of these overwintering sites along the California coast, all the way from the San Francisco Bay Area down through Baja. And we'll talk a little bit more about those here in a minute, but just to give you a sense of where they are distributed. So if you are in Eastern Oregon in August or early September and see a butterfly heading south or southwest, it's heading to one of these sites here along the California coast. Now, we know a fair amount about how and where these butterflies are coming from different tagging experiments that have been done over the years. So the green lines here are butterflies that were tagged in the end of the summer, so in the fall, for the fall migration, and then recovered on the coast. The blue ones are butterflies that were tagged or in the winter, and then we sort of saw where they went in the spring. And this helps give us a sense of where these butterflies are coming from, where they're going. And we need to do more of these to better understand the migration. We also have used, not me, but scientists studying this have used isotopes. So different ratios of different isotopes in the butterflies in the overwintering sites, to be able to understand where they come from regionally. And so what's interesting to me is that for the most part, the highest proportion of butterflies at the different overwintering sites studied here along the California coast came from this beige, this beige colored area in the US. So Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, Idaho, Montana. It was from this landscape that the bulk, except for here, like this is, except for for the rest of these, the greatest proportion of butterflies came from that region. So this just goes to show you that, we are sending butterflies to California in a significant way. And then it's fun, there are a number of efforts out there to track butterflies. You all can log into something like Journey North, and literally right now, we should actually pull it. Afterwards, I'll pull it up and see where we're at. This is just some data I grabbed, years ago from 2016, just to show how over time people are able to put information into a map, and we can see how over time the butterflies spread across the western states. So you can see here for Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, we're looking here May 24th. That's when we start to see butterflies showing up in this neck of the woods. And then after June 20th, we start to see them spread throughout. Some great data was collected by some colleagues over at the College of Western Idaho a few years ago, and thanks to them for their slides. But looking sort of at the Treasure Valley region, adjacent to a lot of you, maybe in Eastern Oregon, over a couple of years, they were documenting where butterflies were present and looking at eggs and first, second, third, fourth, fifth instar, and seeing butterflies in 2016 showing up end of May and having peak numbers of egg laying by I guess that's the end of the first week of June, and then seeing emergence peaking here, sort of the 4th of July week, give or take, and then seeing a couple of peaks of egg laying. So really 2 solid and really even a 3rd generation that they were able to document in 2016. If we look at 2017, they did this project again. Butterflies came a little bit later. So the year before, let me just go back. Year before, they started seeing butterflies the 3rd week of May. This year, they started seeing them more like the end of the 2nd week of June. So, it was a little colder, maybe. There was just a little longer for them to get there. But this year, they only saw 2 solid generations there in Idaho. It just goes to show you each year, conditions are a little bit different naturally. And for you all in the eastern part of Oregon and Washington, you can basically begin to expect seeing butterflies end of May, maybe early part of June. All right, so that's just a big picture on the migration. Really, just life cycle, just kind of what's going on with monarchs in general. But of course, we're thinking about their conservation. We're thinking about their habitat needs. So I want to spend some time kind of walking through some of these things when we think about, as we're planning habitat, we're planning to do work to support monarch butterflies. What do they need? And at a high level, they need safe places to breed, to migrate, to overwinter. They need those milkweed host plants. They need diverse nectar sources and some access to clean water along the way. So I want to spend a little time talking about each of these. All right, milkweed biology. So obviously, I mean, milkweed is the heart, milkweed is the heart of monarch conservation. Yeah, we end up spending a lot of time talking about milkweed. And if we look at a landscape like, let's say, Eastern Oregon or even Eastern Washington, milkweed's out there in a whole wide variety of different habitats. Open grasslands, roadsides here, deserts, river canyons, wetlands. Actually, in this case, we're getting down into a wetter area where the showy milkweed was super abundant. Roadsides, ditches, irrigation canals. I mean, we find milkweed in just a lot of different places in the landscape. There's a fair amount of it already out there. There are about 72 milkweed species native to the US and Canada. About 40 of these species are found in the Western US. And when it comes to Oregon and Washington, really, we're focused primarily on two species that are most abundant and would be most frequently used in conservation. That's showy milkweed, Asclepias speciosa, narrowleaf milkweed, Asclepias fascicularis. These are the two most broadly distributed species in Oregon and Washington. I will say in Oregon, we do have a third species that's actually, you gotta admit, it's kind of a cool looking milkweed plant. Pallid milkweed, Cryptoceras. Cool species. Actually, for where we do the our training, when we're going to do our training in the field, one of the sites we considered for the field training that Sarah Gardner over there at Pollinator Partnership was able to look at, which we probably won't go to because it's actually, we won't be going to it because it doesn't have quite enough of the habitat we need. But it had like an eroding slope that was full of pallid milkweed, and I don't know, it's a cool plant. It's pretty small though, so I actually even wonder how effective it is as a host plant because it's it's not always the biggest one compared to, say, showy milkweed or even narrowleaf milkweed. But still, it's a cool plant. These are our cool milkweeds that are out there. For those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with them, there are a couple of easy ways to help identify it. I mean, with so many plants, the best time, of course, is when it's either in bloom or fruiting. For several years, I half seriously was trying to get the name of the milkweed changed from milkweed to the monarch flower or the monarch plant, because really the flower of a milkweed plant really looks like a crown, right? Like you've got these petals and sepals the sepals are curved back, the petals sticking out. And actually, I might have that even reversed, but you've got this sort of crown-like shape to it. I don't know, it's a cool flower. It's pretty unique. You've got these very obvious, I would say, very unique seed pods that are out there that you can see both when they're developing after the flower and then, usually well into the fall. They've typically, for the common species like showy milkweed, they've got this tall, upright growth form. Not so much with the pallid milkweed. It's a little bit more compact and low to the ground. And of course, it's called milkweed because it's got this milky sap. I don't know, most people, after seeing it a little bit in the field, it's pretty easy to identify over time, especially once it's, like I said, it's got these flowers showing up. Another interesting thing, natural history tidbit about milkweeds is that they don't have pollen like that loose powder that so many, that most plants have. They actually gather their pollen into little saddlebags called pollinia. And then these pollinia are like trapped in these little sort of wedges in the flower and end up getting pulled out. You can see some here on the leg of this honeybee. They basically get pulled out and attached to insects. So you end up with insect legs or mouth parts and all sorts of different parts of their body with these weird little saddle-baggy kind of collections of pollen gathered onto them. So you might actually see this on bees sometimes, especially butterflies too, out there in the field. I don't know. It's just another weird thing about milkweed to have these pollinia structures. Of course, the seed pods stand out. Seed pods are useful, I don't know, just from a natural history perspective. Once these dry out, once you've got all this floss that is on the seeds that help them fly around, those silky fibers have been used for years for things like upholstery padding, hypoallergenic fillings for pillows and mattresses. They used to be used for life vests, stuffing life vests, particularly during World War II. And you can imagine all the birds grabbing them to shove them into birds' nests. So it's interesting, like as a plant in the landscape, it's had some enormous economic importance, particularly going back to the time around the Second World War. But even today, when it comes to hyperallergenic for people who are allergic to a lot of different things, this floss ends up being a really, I don't know, it's grown as a crop in some parts of the country, just for the floss, which is kind of interesting. So there are very few things you might confuse it with in Oregon and Washington. But the two plants that are most likely to cause some confusion are the dogbanes, so Apocynon species here in Oregon and Washington. They're from the same family, like milkweed and dogbane are both in the dogbane family. The fruit is also a pod, but as you can see here, it's kind of this narrow, skinny, round pod. It does have milky sap and it does have similar shaped leaves, but the flowers, and I'll show a couple more pictures in a second, are much more bell-shaped, and they just don't have that crown structure. They're actually great pollinator plants. They're including as an important, valuable nectar plant for monarchs. So this is actually a plant we would potentially include in habitat plantings for monarch butterflies in Oregon or Washington, but it's not good food for the monarch caterpillars to eat. So it's not a host plant for the caterpillars, but it's a decent nectar source. So there are two species. Hemp dogbane is one. You can see, there is a crown-like sort of shape to this, but it's more of a bell-shaped flower. Doesn't have that really distinctive crown with the top and the bottom flaring out. In the case of hemp dogbane, and it's even more obvious sort of bell-shaped flower here for spreading dogbane. So yeah, species that does well in drier areas. Got it here up in Calgary, Alberta, where I currently live. But yep, not milkweed. So just something to keep in mind. All right, but milkweed alone, that host plant for the butterfly, not enough. So the adult monarch butterflies, to fuel their migration, to fly out across the west in the springtime, to make their way all the way back to the coast of California at the end of the summer and the fall, they need nectar, they need some fresh water. They mostly need nectar to fuel that migration. They need that energy drink. And they're generalists. They'll visit a whole variety of non-native and native species. However, there are some plant species that are particularly important nectar sources for monarchs. So I want to just give some highlights of a few of them. One thing Xerces has done in collaboration with NRCS over the last decade or so is to manage a database of monarch nectar plants from across the country. And in fact, if you go to our website, you go to the website here, there's even a link if you scroll down through those pages to where if you see a monarch out there, on a feeding on nectar on a plant, where you can even help us document that if that's of interest. But through the use of this process, gathering data from scientists, from the literature, from a whole variety of other partners and documented sources, we've put together a really comprehensive and rigorous list of nectar species. When we talk about the habitat evaluation guide next week, we're going to lean into that a little bit. We've got supporting plant lists that go along with that guide that were developed from this overall database. So purple sage, mountain monardella, Pacific aster, western coneflower, Missouri goldenrod, yellow rabbitbrush, swamp verbena, blanket flower. These are all just examples of different nectar species that are out there. I think one thing to keep in mind as we're not going to talk a lot about planting habitat today, but we will next week, and thinking about having diverse nectar sources available throughout the time period when monarchs are going to be present, wherever you might be planting habitat. It's an important thing to keep in mind. And this is where things like those rabbit brushes, having, rabbit brush or euphemia, which is not here. What is that? Golden top. These late season nectar sources to fuel up butterflies as they fatten them up to get them ready to head to the coast for the winter. It's important for us to be thinking about things like that, as well as feeding them as they're moving around in the landscapes over the summer. I want to just give a little bit more, I guess, make the case even more for milkweed. The thing about milkweed as a plant, particularly showy milkweed, but even narrowleaf milkweed, it is amazing the abundance and diversity of insects you will see visiting those flowers to gather nectar and pollen. So bees, whether those are bumblebees, sweat bees, leafcutter bees, honeybees, not so much mason bees because they're out earlier, but digger bees, sunflower bees, a lot of these bees that nest in the ground midsummer. Oh my God, like these flowers are alive. It's half the fun of working on monarchs is you get milkweed established and those flowers are just supporting a ton of other pollinators. You'll also see flies, wasps, butterflies, moths. There's a whole huge variety of other insect groups you'll see. Hummingbirds will visit those plants for nectar. And then a lot of the insects that attack crop pests, including some beetles, some wasps, even some of the flies, will gather nectar from those flowers and keep themselves strong. Now, the vegetation and the fruit that we get from those plants, I mean, there are a lot of specialist herbivores, seed bugs, longhorn beetles like we see up here, leaf beetles. There are a lot of other critters that just make their living off of milkweed. And then, like I mentioned before, birds will use the seed floss and stalk fibers for nesting material. So it's a plant that gets used in a lot of different ways by a lot of different animals in the landscape. On top of that, oleander aphid is totally common to see on these. And you might think this little yellow aphid that's all over this plant. In fact, there's a little lady beetle in there feeding on them. What's great about oleander aphid is unless you're growing oleander, it doesn't really jump to a lot of other plants. Like it's not an aphid. Certainly it's not a crop pest aphid. And what it ends up doing is serving as a pretty amazing alternative host for a huge variety of beneficial insects that you could actually build up on those aphids in order to have them available for managing pests. I mean, it'd be mostly managing aphid pests in adjacent crops. So you'll have syrphid fly larvae, you'll have lady beetle larvae and lady beetle adults. You have these crazy little parasitoid wasps straight out of the Aliens movies laying eggs inside of these aphids, and then they just get eaten from the inside out, leaving these cocoons behind. You'll even have lacewings. Like these are all lacewing eggs laid here, and these are voracious predators that, I mean, they're so voracious that at least this species, the green lacewing, lays its eggs on a stalk, so when they hatch, they don't just immediately go around eating all the other eggs or all the other larvae that are hatching out. So you just have this tremendous group of predators and parasitoids that are attacking, that could be moving over then to attack crop pests. So I don't know, it's just an amazing plant when it comes to driving a whole variety, like supporting a whole variety of other animals, pretty much all of which provide some sort of benefits either for nature or for adjacent agriculture. I mean, like I said, especially if you've got pests that are some that are soft-bodied and little like aphids, or some caterpillars that, lady beetles and syrphid flies and parasitoid wasps and things like that would attack. All right, there's my case for milkweed. All right, let's talk about status. That's a lot of natural history. If you've got questions or things you're like, all right, Mace, what the heck? Yeah, like we said, feel free to put a question in the chat. But I want to move on and talk about here what we know about the overwintering status of monarch butterflies for a little bit, because this really drives our understanding and our concern, frankly, for the conservation status of this species in the West and, well, frankly, in the East as well. So over the last, oh my goodness, now 30-ish years, almost 30 years, Xerces has organized and run a Western monarch Thanksgiving count. It's actually now a Western monarch Thanksgiving and New Year's count, and it may even be getting another new name. We're basically now counting butterflies around Thanksgiving and then around the New Year to be able to assess their status. You can imagine all these butterflies coming to one area gives us a pretty nice opportunity to understand what's happening with the overall population. And the same holds true in Mexico, where every springtime we get a report out as to how many butterflies are down at those overwintering sites in Mexico to give us an understanding of the status of the eastern population. But as we look here in the west, there are about 200 sites. It might be up even more than 250 sites now in coastal California. A few of them are inland, a couple are in Arizona, where we organize volunteers to count the population. So we've got, this has been coordinated by Xerces, as well as a co-founder, Mia Monroe, who's a biologist, was a biologist with the U.S. Park Service north of San Francisco. I'm pretty sure she retired last year. This effort relies on more than a dozen, not actually, there are a lot of volunteer regional coordinators and literally hundreds of volunteer counters who get out every winter to count butterflies. And as you can see over the years, we've been able to document this sort of decline. I mean, basically things dropped in the 90s and we've seen this sort of up and down, let's just say, population really for the last 20 years. We got really scared in the winter of 1920, 21. I'm sorry, 2020, 21, where the population went from maybe 300-ish thousand to 200,000 to 20,000, and then down to 2,000 over the course of those 3 years. Like we were pretty worried we lost the butterfly. We saw a pretty amazing rebound to, again, the low 200,000s to even 300,000 in the last couple of years. So that is great, shows you the resilience of insects. So that's super helpful. But I want to point out that these numbers down here have stayed relatively low, and that's in spite of this line here. This line here is literally the number of sites that are being monitored. So we have only seen really an increase overall in the number of site monitored. So we were seeing more places all across the coast of California and seeing relatively fewer butterflies. What we don't have on this graph is what the population looked like in the 1970s and 80s, where the estimates were here. You can see this topping out at about 1.2 million. In the 80s, we were probably somewhere between 3 and 10 million. So way off of this chart, leading us to where we are today. So if we compare to the 1980s, we've seen an overall 95% decline. And just to make this point about even with this increased monitoring effort, seeing really no more, and for several years, almost no butterflies, the number of monarchs we see per site has gone down dramatically since the late 90s. So whereas on average we would see 6,000 butterflies, give or take, per site, we're now seeing more in the order of 1,500, 1,700 on average per site. And I don't know what this looks like for 2014 to today. My guess is it's going to be down probably even a little bit lower. So as a result of this, the International Union of Conservation Nations, the Red List for Threatened Species, has designated the monarch as the migratory monarch as a vulnerable species. The Endangered Species Act has it as currently a candidate species, with a decision that'll probably be made should be made sometime fall to December of this year. And the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has it listed as a special status invertebrate. So it's got this conservation status, which is of course one of the reasons why NRCS is focused on it, as NRCS as an agency collaborates with the Fish and Wildlife Service to try to support declining species. You know, this is one that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is concerned about, as are several state agencies. I just want to make a bit of an aside point that I think is important to know. When I first started doing insect and pollinator conservation work 25 years ago, we were mostly concerned about species that were maybe associated with a unique habitat. Maybe they were just naturally rare, or they're associated with a habitat that's in decline. So we thought, okay, great, we're going to help protect these habitats. We'll protect the species associated with them. That really felt like the heart of our work. What's interesting is that we have seen in the last 20 years, still certainly species associated with rare or declining habitats go down. But we've also seen decline in common and widespread butterfly species. The monarch is the poster child for that, but you could pick painted ladies, you could pick mourning cloak. In fact, you could pick almost any butterfly in the Western United States. So there are a couple of really large long-term data sets that have been recently analyzed and shown that almost all butterflies, literally almost all Western butterflies, have declined at a rate of 1.6% per year consistently for the last 40 years. So if we sum all that up, I mean, that's almost a 50% decline in pretty much all butterfly species in the Western states. So, you know, some of the drivers we're going to talk about here in a moment for the monarch obviously would apply to these species as well. But I just think it's an interesting context to think about when we think about monarch conservation. So yeah, just something to be aware of out there as we're doing really pollinator conservation work in general in the Western states. Yeah, there are some good conservation reasons to be focused on it. But let's dig in. Why are monarchs in trouble? I'm going to hit on a bunch of these things: habitat, overwintering habitat, pesticides, climate change, disease, parasites, predation. We're going to touch on all of these right now. So obviously, I mean, this is with a ton of wildlife, a ton of different species. When we've got agricultural intensification and expansion, fence row to fence row farming, if we've got too much grazing, more grazing on the ground than can be supported, when we've got development, whether that's urban, exurban, infrastructure, other land management that eliminates habitat, there are just a lot of ways that we have lost habitat for monarch butterflies over the last many years. So it's not that it's gone. In fact, many of you are probably thinking to yourselves, well, I see milkweed all over the place. I mean, it is. It's widespread, but it's often sparse. And there are other factors that, you know, go into, you know, potentially making it hard for monarchs to even find that habitat. So one thing that I think is important as we look at doing conservation work, habitat work in the Western states, particularly in the dry West, and we'll talk again more about this as we talk about planning, but as we think about some of the efforts currently underway with things like beaver dam analogs and greening up more of the West, trying to create these avenues and additional places where we've got abundant milkweed is super important. So we've got just more resilience in this landscape as time goes on. We've also, if we look broadly at loss of milkweed across the whole country, you know, herbicides and herbicide-resistant crops are considered a pretty important driver of monarch declines in the East. Evidence is a little bit less clear in the West, but certainly you could imagine high herbicide use in places like the Central Valley of California, some of the big areas of Eastern Washington, maybe the Snake River Plain of Idaho. We'll certainly see less milkweed in those landscapes than we would have in the past. We've also over the years heard anecdotal reports of targeted eradication of milkweed on rangelands because of people concerned about livestock toxicity. I want to dwell on this for a minute in that we've got colleagues that we've spoken to at the Poison Plants Lab in, where is that? In Western Colorado, that USDA manages, and they have not seen a case of livestock poisoning, at least a reported case of livestock poisoning from milkweed in decades, like in a really long time. And the species we focus on, showy milkweed and even narrowleaf milkweed, first of all, they're much less toxic than other species of milkweed. There are some milkweeds out there where I've had some sheep farmers, sheep ranchers tell me down in Texas and Oklahoma, you know, they had some stands of some really very skinny leaf milkweed that we don't necessarily have here in the West that got mixed in with some stuff, and those sheep somehow managed to eat a lot of it. And yeah, that didn't end well. But I've gone to places and seen cattle after the intermediate wheatgrass hardens off, cattle just take milkweed, showy milkweed down to the nub. So I don't think it tastes great to them, but it's nearly impossible for them to eat enough of it to make themselves sick, for sure. And in fact, we're collecting data on the nutritional value, believe it or not, of common milkweed in the Great Plains, showy milkweed in the West, and really finding that it actually has some pretty significant protein and micronutrients. It's actually a pretty nutritious plant for livestock, for cattle, let's say in particular. Yeah, and probably just tastes pretty gross. I mean, for the most part, it's not the sort of plant that livestock are going to eat, unless there's really bad, bad management, they're just left on some ground for too long, and it's literally all that's left. Although they do like to eat the flowers, actually. I should say that there. A lot of cows will go out there and nibble off of milkweed flowers. So anyway, just something to keep in mind. Like, it's, from my perspective, from what I've learned and gleaned over the last several years of asking about this, particularly again for showy milkweed and narrow-leaf milkweed, it's not really a problem. And most of the work that we would do would be focused on showy milkweed, which, yeah, like I said, maybe even has some nutritional value. If we just stick on this theme of loss of milkweed, there's a lot of herbicide use, in rights of ways like railroads and roadsides, irrigation ditches, etc. We end up losing a lot of milkweed that way as well, as you can see here along this. I think this is a railroad embankment. Insecticides obviously can be a threat to monarch butterflies. Herbicides indirectly harm them by removing milkweed, but insecticides, if they come in contact with monarchs, can be lethal or sublethal, meaning they're just, maybe they grow more slowly, they don't lay as many eggs, they're not able to navigate. There are a lot of sublethal effects that can pretty dramatically affect a population. And these are just some pictures from insecticide poisoning that happened in Portland, just to help illustrate that this certainly can happen. And as we think about conservation planning and habitat planning for monarchs, we should be thinking about how do we help protect that habitat from insecticide exposure. And that will come up, and we'll talk about it in greater length when we talk about the habitat evaluation guide, which has us looking at what's the potential risk and mitigations for risk from insecticides, as well as herbicides, and then the key habitat elements of nectar and milkweed plants. Less of an issue for sure, not an issue for Oregon and Washington, but certainly in California, overwintering habitat loss and degradation is a big driver. You got a loss of habitat to development. That's some pretty expensive real estate there along the coast, as you can imagine. We lost a ton of sites in the 80s and 90s to housing. We continue to lose sites. And then as these different groves where the monarchs overwinter get old and basically senesce, start to die back, that opens up holes, that opens up space where they lose that kind of quality microhabitat that keeps them warm, that keeps the wind down, etc. So yeah, we're definitely losing sites there along the coast, which makes it harder for the monarchs to overwinter. Climate change for sure is an issue at play. You've got drought years that likely played a role in some of those really low numbers of butterflies. Short term, all the fires, we don't really know how the fires affected butterflies, the monarch, the years where they were happening. It's possible that there could be growth back after those fires that might be beneficial. It's possible. I think those are things where scientists are looking into. But certainly on droughty years, and we've had a ton of them, there's just less vigorous plant growth, less nectar, less milkweed, just less plants out there. I will say, though, if we can get milkweed established, it is a pretty drought-tolerant plant, which makes it one for us to be thinking about as we're trying to think about mitigating or having more resilience to drought. Extreme weather can be a problem. We've had big winter storms, for example, bigger winter storms. Or these atmospheric rivers we keep hearing about that just this year again hit the coast hard, hit California coast hard. That can be hard in those overwintering sites. Just those warmer temperatures in general happening earlier in the year or later in the year make it harder for monarchs to have that rest period to just shut down and not be in diapause. If they break out of those winter clusters early, we don't necessarily have the milkweed or the nectar plants available for them in the landscape. And so there's that potential disconnect there, thanks to climate change or because of climate change. Last, I'll just touch on disease, parasites, predation. There's just a whole lot of things out there that either make monarchs sick or want to eat them. So naturally, only 1 to 10% of monarch eggs and caterpillars will actually become adults. I think those monarch adults are trying to lay upwards of 400 to 500 eggs in their lifespan. You got birds, you got parasitic flies, you got the praying mantises, all sorts of stuff trying to eat monarchs. And then there's a very well-studied parasite called Ophriocistis electroscura that you can see the spores of it here. It will infect monarch butterflies, reduce their migration success. If it's really bad infections, it'll kill them outright. And typically where we see very high levels of OE, as we call it, in those sort of low or non-migratory populations in places like Florida, the Gulf states, and in Southern California. And in fact, it's worth dwelling for a moment. One of the things so many people want to do, because it's both fun and you feel like you're helping out the monarch, is to captive rear them. And disease managing for OE is one of the biggest reasons not to captive rear monarch butterflies. You got to really be on top of it to make sure you're not making new butterflies sick. And I will say too, with captive rearing, if those caterpillars are not able as they grow to see the sky and to really take in their environment, they actually don't have, for whatever reason, they don't have the skills to be able to migrate at the end of the season. So there are some studies out there that show that, if you captive rear monarch butterflies inside, they won't even necessarily migrate where they need to go when they need to go. So anyway, just a lot of reasons for us to focus on habitat conservation and not on captive rearing of monarchs, unless we got it really scientifically dialed in a really significant way. So I'd rather focus on habitat first. All right, we're nearing the end here. Home stretch. I wanted to wrap this up. Oh, actually, let me just take a pause, see if anybody has any questions before I kind of head into this last short section, just about conservation status, habitat, and then I'll keep growing. Just want to see if anyone's got questions before I dive into this last bit. And if not, no worries. Yeah, but be thinking about any questions you might have, and then we can, we'll answer them. We'll take time at the end for questions at the end. I thought it'd be interesting, as a group of folks that are focused on, habitat work, conservation, potentially big landscapes. I thought I'd share a little bit about just some of the research and conservation efforts that are underway to help us better understand how to plan, design, strategize around monarch conservation work in the West. So, there we go. There are a bunch of key knowledge gaps, the questions I get from NRCS state biologists, for example, all the time, that really like, oh, wish I had an answer. And that folks at a lot of state agencies are focused on and trying to figure out, like, really, some of the biggest knowledge gaps are what are those most important breeding habitats and migratory corridors in the West. We're starting to get a better handle on this, but as I think about helping NRCS to craft a monarch conservation strategy, I think this information, as we get more and more refined, is going to be super helpful for helping us target where to put, scarce conservation dollars on the ground, or, incorporate monarch work maybe into other efforts that are underway. We do have a whole number of studies that have been ongoing for years. There are these different community science projects and databases and modeling efforts. I showed those pictures of sightings of monarch butterflies that were captured through Journey North. Xerces, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, has managed this Western monarch milkweed mapper, again, to help us understand where butterflies are, where milkweed is, where we see caterpillars feeding on milkweed across the West. The Monarch Joint Venture, NGO based out of Minnesota, but national NGO based out of Minnesota, they've got a monarch larva monitoring project. And a lot of this has gone into some habitat suitability models that I'll talk a little bit about here in a second. There's a professor at UC Davis who's got this he's the provider of this 40+ year butterfly monitoring data in California. That's been super useful for helping us understand, what's been going on with the monarch population as well. The Department of Defense, that manages a lot of large land areas, has been super interested in Western monarch phenology, and they've been working with us, Tufts University, Washington State University, to conduct research for years. And then there are a lot of folks that have been doing site-specific surveys through the years to understand what's going on with monarchs, tagging studies, for example, to see where they're going, where they're moving in the landscape. So there's just, I don't know, there's a lot of work that's currently underway and more that's getting started, I feel like, every day. I mentioned before these, using isotopes and some of these things that have helped us understand, where monarchs are coming from and where they're going in the West. There have been a couple of these different studies to help us get a sense of that. These Stevens and Fry research back in 2010. I'm pretty sure these were tag studies showing that, butterflies on the coast here were coming from all these different places across the western states. But if we mapping and understanding where breeding habitat is, I really do believe this is going to be what helps us really dial in on, okay, where and how should we be conserving habitat across the West. So for years, going back to 2014, we worked with a whole variety of federal land management agencies to document the known monarch breeding areas in Western states and gathered records from wherever we could. We then created this portal in 2017 to get even more data, whether it's from community scientists, citizen scientists, federal agencies, research partners, to really feed in to help us track where in the green dots we've got milkweed, where with the orange dots are we seeing monarchs and when. And these blue dots or purple, I guess lavender dots, where are we actually seeing caterpillars on the plant as a sign of breeding, successful breeding, and then habitat feeding. And so this has all been, this is something you all can participate in if you want to. The Monarch Milkweed Mapper, all this data goes in here as well as other data sets from scientists. Oops, I'm gonna skip this one real quick. Oh, interesting. Okay, sorry, got a little hiccup here, but that's okay. We sort of expanded this mapping work, 2015, 2016, 2017 to pull in more data, to collect new data. So we actually had our team going out to collect data for a couple of 3 summers to add to this, and then adding to this all these geospatial data layers to try to understand, okay, we're seeing distribution of milkweed, what else are we seeing in the landscape? For example, we do not see really milkweeds and monarchs above 6,000 feet. So as we look, I'm going to show you some maps on habitat suitability. One of the big drivers is, really working below 6,000 feet, if I remember correctly, across, a lot of the states where we work. Again, continue to expand this work. Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Idaho Fish and Game, the Fish and Wildlife Service have been really important partners in continuing to expand and gather this data, as well as those university partners that I was talking about before. And then all this has led to at least initial models on where do we have sort of hotspots of suitable or potentially suitable, or where we think we should have more suitable habitat for monarch butterflies. And really it's these yellow and red areas that we end up focusing on, kind of scattered throughout Eastern Oregon, particularly up along the Columbia River Plateau and throughout Eastern Washington, the Snake River Plain. A lot of these valleys, a lot of our crop growing areas actually in Eastern Oregon really sort of stand out. So if we zoom in on a slightly updated version of this, you can see all the orange to yellow. These are the areas where we're going to do our training, La Grande and Baker City. Like these are the areas where, we've got like potentially suitable habitat, but then of course these big swaths of landscape along the Columbia River plain and throughout Eastern Washington as well. Not to mention, of course, good old southwestern Oregon. It's amazing that Ashland, Medford, Roseburg, this whole area down here, we end up having a lot of monarchs down here that we don't necessarily get in the Willamette Valley. They sort of show up here, but it's pretty sporadic, whereas they can be really common down in southwestern Oregon. I don't know, sort of interesting to keep in mind. This we'll probably be spending more time over the next year or two digging into this and thinking about how we can apply some of this modeling to strategic planning for habitat for monarchs. In the next probably year or two ahead. All right, that is our summary. So just to step back, that's the end of our formal show. To step back, we've got a species where we've seen pretty dramatic and dramatic decline that's just stayed low. In fact, had some scary moments where we got down to this population of 2,000, but had a species that has some pretty straightforward habitat needs, milkweed, nectar, protection from insecticides, and a species that with those core habitat needs, I feel like and know that we can incorporate it into a lot of the existing work that we're doing in a way that just adds additional value to a lot of the habitat work or habitat management work we might be doing in, for example, Eastern Oregon, Eastern Washington, and other parts of the West. So I think I want you all to sort of sit on that idea, we're going to talk and think more about that next week as we walk through the elements of the habitat evaluation guide and talk a little bit more about conservation planning. When we meet and talk next week, for those of you who are able to come back live for that, I'm going to be asking, you for some thoughts on, hey, how could you imagine, milkweed being incorporated, or some of these nectar plants being incorporated into your work? I also think one other little point that I think I should have made earlier, now that I'm thinking about it, I do think where we see riparian corridors through the landscape, these are avenues, through which a lot of animals will traverse, and even monarch butterflies, as they're often a little bit, they can be a little bit protected from the wind. They're a little bit cooler, a little bit higher humidity. You've got water closer to the surface, more opportunities for plants to stay green even in drier years. And so thinking about, okay, how can we incorporate some of these habitat elements into riparian corridors, or, to the edges, or even into some of our wetlands, for example, that we might be working on or protecting. These are all things we'll spend some time thinking about. So yeah, milkweed, nectar plants, protection from insecticides. Yeah, we'll have lists to share as we go through the wildlife habitat evaluation guide and the instructions for that. And just as a reminder, yeah, that next webinar is a week from today at the same time, 3 to 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Yeah, with that, Christina, I think we will call it good. There, I just talked at you all for an hour.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mace. And I just want to let everybody know I dropped the quiz in the chat. I'm going to try to get this recording kind of refined and out to people by the end of this week or early next week. And additionally, the quiz I can share independent of this, of today. So if you want to rewatch it, then I will provide that to you. But for those of you who know that you have your colleagues that wanted to attend but couldn't be here, feel free to let them know that that's kind of my timeline, or have them reach out to myself and I can relay that information to them. So again, always a pleasure, Mace. That was awesome. I don't see any questions in the chat, and people may just be digesting this information, or maybe you covered it so well. But if there are questions in the future, feel free to reach out to me. I can get either get you in touch with Mace or try to provide answers to those. And I appreciate everyone's attendance, and I definitely appreciate Mace giving us this presentation. So
Thanks, Christina.
yeah.
I'll add too, as people are thinking about that, sort of that little bit of homework I provided about thinking about where we could be incorporating habitat into these different landscapes in Oregon, Eastern Washington, that may bring questions up, and we can either talk about those next week, or when when a big group of us meets in the field in June, that'll be another time for us to really dig in, have a good back and forth. It's always hard on a webinar to do that. Plus, we might even see monarch butterflies. I don't know. It's a decent year in California this year. We'll be hitting the ground in that second week of June. So could be good.
Perfect. Yeah,
right.
I'm super excited. And just so everyone on the call knows, there are a lot of folks from Washington that have joined this webinar today. And just so you're aware, I know Peter jumped on for a short while today, but he's currently on leave. He's communicating with Mace and I pretty frequently, and we're all trying to refine and revise these types of workshops to make it more valuable to everybody. And so we're trying to cross-pollinate, get it? Yeah, cross-pollinate across the state so that we can maximize our efforts and increase consistency. So
that's great.
With that, I'm going to stop the recording unless anybody has any questions, or Mace, if you have anything else to say.
The only thing I'll say, if there are folks on from Washington, yeah, just as a reminder, we'll be in the field with you all in Pullman the week of May 21st. So anyway, we've got that, just so you know, Christine, I've got that training coming up for them as well before you and I get to hang out in the field. So
fun. All right, well, I appreciate it, and I'm gonna stop recording, and feel free to leave the chat if you need a link to the quiz. Again, reach out to myself, or I think you can all revisit the chat and get that link. So
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, everybody.
you're welcome.